I went to lunch with my wife's sister and saw her at the next table with her lover, laughing as if the outside world didn't exist. The fork trembled in my hand, but what fell was the weight of illusion. I got up, paid for what I'd barely eaten, and walked away from that scene. "You chose your end the moment you smiled at him," I said as I left. She tried to justify it later, but her lover made it clear he didn't want anything serious. Alone, she faced her regret too late. I, in due time, found a new love, one with a calm gaze, a gentle presence, and truth in his heart. When she sought me out, I listened without rancor and offered forgiveness. Not because I wanted her back, but because I deserved to move on in peace. Today, we remain distant, she with the weight of loss, I with the lightness of having started over. That was the last time I uttered anything that sounded definitive. Because nothing there was simple. Not lunch, not the trembling fork, not the weight of the illusion that fell to the floor. That was the crumbling of a story I believed would last forever. I believed, she didn't. And that's where the whole lies. I believed with everything, with every piece, with every attempt to make it work. I looked at her and saw my home, I saw my peace, I saw my future. She looked at me and saw a gap between desires that no longer included my existence. She smiled at another man with the kind of lightness I'd never seen in our marriage. And it wasn't the smile that killed me, it was the contrast. How happy she seemed while I chewed, deep in my throat, the bitter taste of no longer being enough. As she smiled, I bled inside. And it wasn't even warm blood anymore, it was cold, heavy, like emotional lead. In that instant, I realized, there are betrayals that don't come from touch, but from the absence of it. I didn't need to wait for her to see me. I didn't need to hear an explanation. I saw. I understood. The world stopped in that second, and at the same time, everything moved on as if nothing had happened. The city didn't collapse, the cars kept passing, the waiters kept serving tables, people continued their lives. Only I stopped. Only I broke inside. Betrayal has this power, it destroys silently amidst the daily noise. I remember the sound of silverware hitting the tables, her laughter like a knife, and the feeling of being a stranger in my own story. I could have stood up and made a scene. I could have screamed, poured all my hatred onto that table shared by two lies with legs. But I didn't. And it wasn't out of pride. It was because I understood that when true love dies, the wake is silent. I simply paid for the plate I'd barely touched, and walked away carrying not the food, but the disappointment she'd unknowingly served. Betrayal, this disgrace, never begins with a kiss, it begins long before, the day the gaze shifts, the day the cell phone is turned face down, the day her presence begins to weigh heavily. And yet, even after everything, she tried to explain. He tried to tell me it wasn't what it seemed. That she was confused. That it was a mistake. That she still loved me. But what kind of love is this that sits with another man while her husband breathes across the restaurant? What kind of love is this that smiles as if everything were at peace, while the other's soul writhes? What hurt me wasn't that she was with someone else, it was that she seemed happy there, more than she ever seemed to be with me. I didn't need proof. Heartbreak, when it arrives, screams. It screams in looks, in gestures, in silences. And that day, everything screamed. Even my silence. Even my absence. When I left, I didn't just leave that place. I left the idea I had of us. I left the future I built alone. I left the past she erased with a single gesture. Days later, she appeared. Red-eyed, her voice cracking, trying to mend something that was already broken. She said her lover didn't want anything serious. That he'd moved away. That he realized he truly loved me. But it wasn't about that anymore. It wasn't about love anymore. It was about value. About his absence. About the fact that what's broken can't be mended, it can only be replaced with something new. And yet, I listened. I listened to her every word without interrupting, not out of respect, but because I was no longer the same. It was as if I'd lived years in days. I listened because forgiving wasn't about bringing her back. It was about freeing myself. It was about lifting the weight she placed on me. And it was in that void, in that interval between goodbye and never again, that I met another love. And it was different. It wasn't burning passion, it wasn't euphoria. It was peace. It was presence. It was lightness. It was the kind of love that doesn't weigh, that doesn't demand proof, that doesn't live on justifications. It was the kind of love we only recognize after having loved wrongly. And perhaps that's the greatest tragedy of those who betray, realizing too late the value of what was lost. Because regret comes. It always comes. But it comes when the other person is gone. And when she came back, trying to understand if there was any chance, I simply looked her in the eye and said, "I don't carry anger, I've just learned to move on." She cried. She cried for everything that wasn't. She cried for what she threw away. She cried for realizing that the place she now occupied belonged to someone else. And I wasn't happy about it. Because I couldn't be cruel, even though I had every reason. I simply offered forgiveness. Not for her, but for myself. Because the peace we feel when we free ourselves from those who didn't know how to love us is greater than any revenge. And the curious thing is that, while she lived with him, she deleted all the photos, all traces of us. But when everything fell apart, she began to revisit our past. And it was there, amidst images of moments she tried to bury, that her regret grew. She drowned in her own mistakes. And she realized that betrayal isn't just about losing the other person, it's about losing yourself. There were nights when she wrote to me and deleted them. Others when she sent messages that I read without responding. She tried to contact my friends. She told her sister she missed me. And she even tried to find me at the places we used to go. But she wasn't the one I expected anymore. And when we ran into each other by chance, and she said she still loved me, I responded with a calm smile, "I loved you too. But today, I love myself." She fell silent. And there, in that silence, I heard more than in all the words she'd ever said to me. Because in that moment, she understood. She understood that I was no longer hers. And that, even though she'd had me for so long, she'd never known how to truly have me. And now, even with forgiveness, we've gone our separate ways. I walk lightly. She, carrying memories she can't relive. And perhaps the cruelest part of betraying someone who loves you is this, knowing you'll never find that kind of love again. Knowing you had it and lost it. Knowing that, deep down, it could have been eternal, but it was ego. It was carelessness. It was choice. And some choices are irreversible. Some choices are the end. And now she lives between the photos she deleted and the ones she tries to recover. Between the laughter she threw away and the tears she collects alone. But one question has stayed with me ever since that day: what makes someone abandon true love for a moment of euphoria? Perhaps the answer lies in the story that still needs to be told. Because what happened next is what really matters. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support or romanticize any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are completely fictitious, but they carry deep truths about choices, losses, and consequences. Our goal is clear: to show how betrayal can destroy what is most valuable: love, trust, and respect. Get ready. What's coming next is a strong, exciting and unforgettable story. Press play. And feel the impact of a decision that changed everything. Gabriel was the kind of man who went unnoticed by those seeking storms, but unforgettable by those who knew how to appreciate calm. He had a restrained way of loving, one that didn't shout, but rather sustained. It wasn't made of grand gestures, but of constancy, of silences that embraced, of small details that said everything words couldn't always convey. He worked as a designer at a small engineering firm, and his routine was marked by bitter coffees, long meetings, and the certainty that, at the end of the day, there was a home waiting for him. A home he himself helped build with his hands, time, and the dedication of someone who deeply believed in love as shelter. He didn't have a hectic life, he wasn't a man of many adventures, but, as far as he was concerned, what he built was solid. When he met Isabel, still young, he fell in love with the lightness in her eyes and the way she made the world seem lighter just by being around. Isabel had a different rhythm. The daughter of a retired teacher and a strict lawyer, she grew up amid pressures and expectations, and perhaps that's why she sought freedom in everything she did. She worked as a decorator and had a keen aesthetic eye, the kind that found beauty where no one else saw it. Isabel wasn't made of pauses, but of impulse. She liked everything intense, fast, vibrant. Her presence was striking, always surrounded by people, conversations, lights. Over time, she learned to slow down alongside Gabriel, and he, in turn, discovered a new lease on life with her. It was as if they lived on different frequencies, but found themselves in a single melody when they were together. It wasn't a perfect love, far from it, but it was a love that was possible, made of learning, compromise, and mutual respect. The wedding came naturally, almost without fanfare. There was no cinematic proposal, no over-the-top party. It was a silent agreement between two hearts who understood that love didn't need fireworks, but truth. They lived in a small apartment, where every object had a story. The kitchen table was an inheritance from her grandmother, the living room bookshelf was assembled by Gabriel on a Saturday afternoon, and the plant in the corner was a birthday present from him. Life was made up of these small gestures that, to others, might seem trivial, but which, to them, were proof that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Isabel's sisters were a constant presence in the couple's daily routine, especially Carla, the youngest, who had a close relationship with Gabriel since the days when he was just my sister's boyfriend. Carla was spontaneous and fun-loving, and her bond with Gabriel was based on respect and admiration. The three of them would often go out together, talk for hours, and there was a mutual trust that seemed unbreakable. Her family always saw Gabriel as a pillar, someone reliable, sensible, and balanced. And he lived up to that image. He was always willing, always present, always trying to keep everything harmonious, even when Isabel plunged into periods of doubt, instability, or fatigue with the routine. As the years passed, life followed its natural course. There were job changes, financial setbacks, postponed plans, short trips, Sunday lunches, friends who drifted away, those who arrived. Life wasn't easy, but it was lived with dignity. Gabriel always believed that the secret of a relationship lay not in great deeds, but in daily care. He observed Isabel with a serene love, trying to understand her even when she seemed incomprehensible. And, silently, he accepted that she was more fickle than he, more sensitive to change, more affected by what the world demanded. And she, in turn, seemed to enjoy the stability he provided. Sometimes Isabel showed restlessness, as if searching for something she couldn't quite grasp. In those moments, Gabriel would step back, without confrontation. He left space. He gave her time. And when she returned, he was there, intact, ready to start over, without asking too many questions. Isabel would sometimes say she felt overwhelmed by everyday life, that she missed living more intensely, that she missed herself. Gabriel listened, tried to be welcoming, offered trips, and suggested changes. He even suggested couples therapy, but she declined with that sweet smile she used when she wanted to avoid a topic. She said the problem wasn't the relationship, it was her. That sometimes she just needed to breathe. And Gabriel, who believed in respecting each other's time, let her breathe, unaware that, little by little, she was drifting away from the air they shared. There were nights when Isabel would take a long time to get home, justifying work commitments or meetings with friends. Gabriel never questioned her. He trusted her. Perhaps too much. Perhaps because he believed that when you love someone, you choose to trust even when it becomes a risky choice. He preferred to harbor doubt rather than harbor distrust. Because love, for him, was also about surrender. And those who surrender sometimes get hurt. But he didn't know that yet. In those days, all he knew was that he continued to love her. Even when she seemed absent. Even when her eyes seemed to be looking somewhere he didn't exist. Wedding anniversaries were celebrated simply. A dinner, a souvenir, a handwritten letter. Isabel kept everything. At least, that's what Gabriel believed. He loved to write. And even though he wasn't a man of many words in everyday life, he expressed everything in the letters he left inside books, in the messages hidden among her clothes, in the notes stuck to the bathroom mirror. Isabel smiled, thanked him, sometimes cried. She said she didn't deserve so much love. And he said she was the one who gave meaning to everything. They were like that, quietly intense. Or at least he was. And he believed she was too. Carla, in turn, always showed affection and attention to her brother-in-law. She had a light-hearted way of dealing with situations and was there for her through good times and bad. She was the kind of person who would show up with ice cream on sad days, or wine on happy ones. Gabriel enjoyed her company, but strictly respected boundaries. He saw Carla almost as a sister, someone he trusted completely. And Isabel never showed any discomfort with this relationship. On the contrary, she said she was grateful to have them so close, that she felt secure knowing they got along well. There were no signs. None. At least, not to Gabriel. There was a time when Isabel started spending more time on her phone, which wasn't unusual for someone with her job. Social media was a part of her life. She said she needed to keep her profile updated, interact, and look for references. Gabriel didn't fully understand this world, but he respected it. Sometimes, he'd watch her smile at the screen, immersed in conversations he didn't know about. But he pushed away any negative thoughts. He wasn't an insecure man. And he preferred to believe that her happiness shouldn't be a cause for doubt. She seemed happy, and that was enough. But there were nights when he slept alone, even with her by his side. There were mornings when she left before he woke up. Gabriel justified it to himself by saying it was just a phase. Every relationship goes through phases. Love, he believed, was also about patience. And if he had to wait for her to find herself again so they could be reunited as a couple, he would wait. He would always wait. Because that was his greatest flaw and his greatest virtue, loving without reservations. His world still revolved around her. And the little she offered, to him, was still everything. Not because he didn't know his own worth, but because he saw value in her, even on the days when she herself felt lost. He carried them both on his back, unaware that she was already walking in another direction. But it was still too early to realize. There were still Sunday lunches, conversations about movies, decisions about what to plant on the porch. There was still a house. There was still a silent hope that held everything together. Until the day the ground began to give way. Slowly. As if something whispered that the truth was approaching. And when it arrived, no silence would be able to hide it. Gabriel began to notice that Isabel was different. It was subtle, like the way she avoided prolonging conversations or her recent habit of putting her phone away face down whenever he entered the room. These weren't aggressive or blatantly suspicious, but they carried an energy he couldn't quite name. She spoke less, zoned out easily, always seemed to be somewhere else, and even when she smiled at him during dinner, the gesture seemed automated, as if her body were repeating what her heart no longer felt. Gabriel wondered if it was fatigue, pressure at work, a new existential crisis like the ones she'd had before, but something inside him ignited a silent unease. He still believed in her, in the love that united them, but there were nights when restlessness kept him awake. And the strangest thing was that she, always so sensitive, didn't realize that he was no longer fully there, or perhaps she didn't want to realize. Their conversations became more distant, their caresses less frequent, and her embrace seemed to no longer find him. He tried to make conversation, asking if she wanted to travel, do something different on the weekend, but she declined, citing fatigue, delayed projects, client commitments. She started going out more, sometimes at night, saying she needed to find partners for new contracts, have wine with a colleague in the industry, visit interior design shows. Gabriel didn't suspect immediately because he'd always trusted her, because he never wanted to be the controlling type, and because he believed a woman needed to have her own life beyond marriage. But there was something in her eyes, something that slipped into her gaze when he surprised her with a compliment, that made him swallow hard. It was as if he spoke a language she no longer heard. Carla was always there, and in a way, she was the bridge between Gabriel and Isabel in moments when everything seemed about to fall apart. Carla treated him with the same affection as always, talking about movies, asking about work, laughing at his jokes, and keeping things light on difficult days. Gabriel, without realizing it, began to find in his wife's sister a kind of familiar comfort, a reminder of the time when he and Isabel still laughed together, still shared hopes, still believed they were building something solid. Carla made a point of showing that she was there for them both, that she rooted for them. She seemed to be the only one who still saw the couple as an us. Isabel, on the other hand, began to respond to Gabriel's messages late, and sometimes not at all. She said she forgot, that she was busy, that she would respond later. And later never came. One day, while having lunch with Carla at a restaurant near work, Gabriel found himself talking too much about his feelings, about how things seemed to be falling apart for no reason. She listened attentively, eyes fixed, without interrupting. She said that maybe it really was just a phase, that Isabel had gone through others like that and always returned to her center, to love. Gabriel smiled with a relief he hadn't felt in days, grateful for her listening, for her presence. They ended lunch in that kind of pleasant silence where there's no need to fill the space with words. That afternoon, Gabriel felt that maybe he was just exaggerating, and that love, in the end, would stand the test of time. But the following days only deepened the emptiness. Isabel seemed increasingly distant. She no longer lay in bed with him, she often slept on the couch, pleading insomnia. When they were together, it was as if an invisible glass separated them. Gabriel would run his eyes over her as if trying to find traces of something that had once been, and she would simply look away. There were no arguments, but there was silence. And silence sometimes screams louder than any argument. He began to pay more attention to the little things. A different perfume. An outfit he'd never seen before. A rush to leave, an unusual delay in returning. Still, he didn't confront her. He preferred to remain silent rather than provoke a storm that perhaps only existed within him. But the fear of being right was greater than the fear of appearing paranoid. One Friday night, she announced she had a design event and would be back late. Gabriel asked if she wanted company, but she politely declined, saying it would be tiring and that he'd be better off resting at home. He respected her. He lay down on the couch and watched the movie she'd said she'd wanted to see with him for weeks but always put off. By the time the movie ended, the clock was almost midnight. He tried calling, but it went to voicemail. He sent a message, which went unanswered. He lay down, but didn't sleep. The sound of the key in the door came almost 2 hours later. She walked in slowly, took off her shoes, and went straight to the bathroom. He pretended to be asleep. She lay down without saying anything, without touching him, and within minutes she was breathing deeply, as if drifting off. Gabriel spent the weekend silent. He observed everything in detail. The way she smiled at her phone, her brief disappearances with vague excuses, her eyes that no longer met his. On Monday, he would have lunch with Carla again. He considered canceling, but felt he needed to talk to someone. He needed someone to tell him it was all a figment of his imagination. When he arrived at the restaurant, Carla was already waiting for him. She smiled, but he couldn't return the smile with the same naturalness. They sat down. They ordered their usual. And Gabriel began to pour out his heart. He said he thought he had lost Isabel, that she no longer seemed the same, that he sensed there was something he didn't know. Carla squeezed his hand across the table and said that sometimes love only disguises itself as absence, but it's still there. He smiled, trying to believe it, and in that moment, something made him look away. It was as if time stood still, as if the noise around them dissolved, as if everything went into slow motion. At the next table, Isabel sat, laughing with a man Gabriel had never seen. She couldn't see him. She was lost in the conversation, the wine, the touch of their hands meeting in the center of the table. Gabriel felt his heart sink. Carla released his hand. He turned slowly, his face pale, and the words escaped his mouth. There was nothing to say. The scene said it all. She was there. With another man. Laughing like he hadn't seen her in months. Vibrant, alive, whole. The happiness she denied at home was now spilling out there, in front of him, shared with another man. The fork in his hand trembled. His stomach churned. He looked at Carla, who looked away. There were no explanations. No defenses. No deception. Isabel finally noticed his presence. She stood still. The smile died on her face. Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Gabriel stood up with the calm of someone in the center of an earthquake. He looked at her as if he saw the end. He simply said, "You chose your end the moment you smiled at him." And he left. Without screaming. Without crying. Without explaining himself. He left the plate he barely touched unpaid. He walked the streets like someone carrying his own funeral. The pain was dull, but it tore. Betrayal had a sour taste, the taste of failure, of brokenness. And the cruelest thing was realizing that, even seeing, even hearing, there was still a remnant of love inside him. Even being betrayed, it still hurt not to have her anymore. And at the same time, I knew I couldn't go back. Because what dies like this isn't reborn. What is violated like this doesn't heal the same way. And for the first time, he understood the weight of being alone. But he also glimpsed, deep down, the lightness of freedom. What he didn't yet know was that this betrayal concealed more than a clandestine encounter. There was something bigger, deeper, about to be revealed. And when it came to light, it would show that what had been lost was much more than a marriage. Isabel spent days in silence after lunch at the restaurant. She sent a few short, almost rehearsed messages, trying to justify the unjustifiable, saying she needed to talk, that nothing was as simple as it seemed. Gabriel read everything without responding. His silence wasn't revenge, it was protection. He knew any hasty words would hurt him even more, so he chose to protect himself. He lived his life on autopilot, working as best he could, eating out of obligation, sleeping little. His stomach still churned at the memory of the scene in the restaurant, her smile that was no longer his, the presence of another where, for years, he'd believed he was the only one. But, as cruel as it was to admit, it wasn't the physical betrayal that hurt the most, but the realization that she hadn't loved him for a long time, perhaps long before the other appeared. Even so, there was something lingering, a unease that grew day by day, as if the truth hadn't yet fully revealed itself. Carla's face also came back to mind frequently, the look in her eyes at that moment, the expression she hid, as if she had seen it before, as if she already knew, as if she was hiding something that Gabriel didn't yet know. It took almost 2 weeks for Isabel to insist so much that he agreed to meet her. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, far from places where they would be recognized. She arrived first, visibly thinner, with deep circles under her eyes and a look that mixed shame and anxiety. He sat across from her, without eye contact. He kept his eyes on the coffee cup he hadn't even touched. She tried to begin, speaking softly, as if stepping on broken glass. She said she knew he was angry, that he had every right to be, that what she did was unforgivable, but that she needed to explain. Gabriel responded in a cold but restrained tone, saying he didn't want explanations about what he already knew. What he needed to know was what she was still hiding. Because he sensed, deep down, that it wasn't just that. Isabel looked away, took a deep breath, and let out a single tear before beginning to speak. She said the affair with that man had begun months earlier, at a professional event. That it wasn't planned, that she hadn't wanted it to happen, but it had. That initially she'd sought lightness, distraction, a way to escape a life she could no longer sustain. Gabriel listened silently, without interrupting, without even blinking. But then she hesitated, and in that instant, he realized, here came what she'd truly been hiding. The true reason for everything was yet to be revealed. Isabel ran her hand through her hair, took another deep breath, and murmured something he didn't understand. He asked her to repeat. And it was then, through tears and a trembling voice, that she revealed what Gabriel could never have imagined. She said that, months before getting involved with her lover, she had begun revisiting old photos. She said that in a moment of impulse and self-anger, she deleted all the images from her cell phone, her computer, and even the external hard drive she'd kept since the beginning of her marriage. She said she wanted to forget the past, pretend it never existed, that erasing it was easier than facing what was fading away. But what Gabriel didn't know, and what he now listened to with a coldness that mixed shock and sadness, was that among those photos were videos, scanned letters, notes he had written over the years, which she had transformed into digital keepsakes. And worse, they also contained the only records of the son they lost years ago in a miscarriage that devastated them at the time. Ultrasound images, letters he wrote to the baby, videos of them preparing the room that was never used. She deleted everything. Gabriel felt the ground sink. The blood seemed to drain from his body. He tried to breathe, but no air came. He stammered a question, unable to believe what he had heard. Did you erase what was left of our son? Isabel was crying hard now, trying to explain that she had done it in a moment of confusion, that she was lost, that she hadn't considered the consequences. She said she had tried to recover later, but it was too late, that she hadn't had the courage to tell him, that she thought he would never know, but that she carried that guilt every day. Gabriel stood, walked to the door, returned, sat down again, and held his face in his hands for minutes. The betrayal with another man now seemed minor compared to the devastation of that revelation. There were things that could be forgiven, but others that simply couldn't be undone. He didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal of her body or the neglect of the memory of something sacred. The child who hadn't been born, but who had lived for weeks inside her, now also no longer lived, not even in her memories. Gabriel whispered that it was more than a mistake, it was a break with everything they had been. He said he could forgive the betrayal because he knew that loves die, that bodies become distracted, that hearts become confused. But that was an erasure of history, of pain, of what had united them in one of the most difficult moments they had ever experienced together. It was as if she had ripped out with her own hands the only thing that still connected them inside. Isabel tried to touch him, but he recoiled. He said he needed to leave. She begged him to listen, that she regretted it, that she thought about that mistake every day, that she had never felt peace since. But he said, in the calmest voice he had ever heard, it's not about regret, it's about what can no longer be lived. And he left. He walked the streets like a man carrying mourning. And indeed he did. The death of trust, of love, of memory. That was an ending greater than any separation. In the following days, Isabel wrote letters, left notes with her sister, sent messages he didn't reply to. He said he'd bought a new album, that he wanted to try to put together what was left, but Gabriel knew it wasn't about photos. It was about everything she'd let die. It was about her disregard for memory, for the value of small things, for the affection he'd kept in every detail, in every letter, in every record. And as she sank into regret, he, for the first time, began to emerge from it all with a strange and painful freedom. It wasn't relief, it was awareness. The awareness that he'd loved as much as he could, but now it was time to love himself. But something was yet to happen. Because not everything had been said. And even after the revelation, what came next would show that there are losses that continue to hurt even when the wound seems to have healed. Gabriel spent weeks without returning to the cafe where he met Isabel. He also avoided the places they used to walk together, the paths that held memories, the household objects that still carried the energy of a time when he believed he was loved. He put the remaining letters in a cardboard box and pushed them to the back of the closet, along with the books she read, the notes forgotten between pages, the gifts that had become irrelevant. It wasn't a ritual of revenge, it was simply an attempt to start over. His silence was now denser, but no longer bitter. He felt emptied of expectations, like someone who has walked to the end of a dark hallway and realized the only way out was to return to himself. Time no longer flowed, it dragged. Until one Sunday afternoon, as he was leaving the market, he found Carla on the sidewalk, struggling to carry bags. Gabriel hesitated for a second, but walked up to her and offered to help. Carla smiled in surprise and accepted. They walked to her building in silence, and when they reached the door, she invited him upstairs. He accepted, not for lack of choice, but out of a vague curiosity that he couldn't control. Carla's apartment was small and cozy, with plants in makeshift pots and family photos scattered across the shelves. Gabriel sat on the sofa, and she brought him 2 cups of tea. Her presence didn't bother him, but there was something in her eyes, a new heaviness, a barely concealed discomfort. He thanked her for the drink and said he didn't intend to stay long. She nodded and replied that she understood. But before he left, he needed to hear something. Gabriel looked up and, for the first time since the end, looked Carla straight in the eye, expecting anything but what would come next. She took a deep breath and said she felt responsible too, that she should have told him the truth from the beginning, that he deserved to know everything. Gabriel clasped his hands on his knees, attentive but unhurried. Carla seemed to struggle with herself, as if her burning throat held back words too heavy. Carla revealed that she had known about Isabel's involvement since before lunch at the restaurant. He said he tried to convince her to stop, that he insisted she tell the truth, that he cried, that he threatened to leave. But Isabel, lost in her own desires, chose to continue. Gabriel listened quietly, absorbing every detail like someone putting together the pieces of a tortuous puzzle. But Carla's confession wasn't over yet. She stood up, walked to a drawer, and removed a yellowed envelope, worn with age. She handed it to him with trembling hands and asked him to read it aloud, even though it hurt. Gabriel hesitated, but complied. He opened the envelope and found a letter, written by Isabel almost 2 months ago, never sent. In her handwriting, the content was devastating. She confessed not only her regret for the betrayal but also admitted that, during that period, she had become close to Carla to try to justify her actions. She said she used her sister as a shield, as an alibi, as an emotional justification. She revealed that some of the outings she claimed to have with Carla never happened, that she used her name to cover up meetings with her lover, and worse, that she even invented disagreements between the two to distance Carla from Gabriel, fearing that the relationship between the two would become uncomfortable or revealing. Gabriel felt his body sink into the sofa. This wasn't just betrayal, it was manipulation. Isabel hadn't just deceived him, but she'd also ensnared people he loved in the web of her own selfishness. He looked at Carla, who was now crying silently, and felt something akin to compassion. Not for Isabel, but for Carla, for having been used, ensnared, for having silently carried a secret that was more corrosive than any hurt. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the world went on. Inside, he felt as if he were burying a second version of that story, one even dirtier, crueler, more indigestible. Carla apologized, her voice breaking. She said she hadn't had the courage to tell him before because she was afraid he would hate her, or worse, that he would think she had a hand in it. Gabriel turned and hugged her. There was no more room for resentment. The embrace wasn't just comfort, it was closure. In the days that followed, Gabriel replayed the events like someone revisiting an accident, trying to understand where he lost control. But there wasn't a single moment that explained everything. It was an accumulation of gestures, absences, unspoken words. And now, more than ever, he knew there was nothing left to salvage. Isabel asked to see him again. She said she needed to end things with dignity, that she wanted to at least look him in the eye without him hating her. Gabriel agreed, not for her sake, but because he felt he, too, needed to close that door firmly. They met at the park where they usually walked on Sundays. She arrived first, as always, dressed simply but with a drawn face. There was something human about her now that hadn't been there before, shame. Gabriel sat beside her, keeping a distance. She thanked him for coming and said she didn't expect reconciliation, only understanding. She said that for a long time she felt suffocated by a love she didn't know how to reciprocate, that her mistake was trying to fill the void with something that wasn't hers, and that she lost herself in her own escape. She said that now, after everything, she understood what she lost. Gabriel responded calmly. He said he understood, but that understanding didn't negate the consequences. He said the betrayal wasn't the end, but that what she did with the memories was unforgivable. That the pain of losing her son was already immense, but the loss of the memories was a kind of double death. She cried. She said she knew, that she thought about it every day, that if she could go back, she would do everything differently. He didn't reply. They were silent for a few seconds until he said he forgave her. She looked up in surprise, as if unexpected, and he explained, "It's not for you, it's for me. I don't want to carry you for the rest of my life. You're no longer in me." She nodded, wiped her eyes, tried to smile, but failed. Before leaving, she handed him an envelope. She said they were copies of old letters, rescued from emails, from printouts forgotten in folders. Gabriel put them away without opening them. He walked to the other side of the park, without looking back. Life went on. Slowly, but it did. Time passed, and with it came new, less burdensome mornings, new, less suspicious glances, new places without shadows. Gabriel began to reconnect with the world. To smile again. To walk different paths. To discover silence without pain. And one autumn afternoon, while reading in a local bookstore, he met Marina. A woman with a soft voice, deep eyes, and a serenity that reminded him so much of what he once was. Their conversation began shyly, but grew over time. Marina didn't ask questions about the past, and perhaps that's why he felt the urge to talk. She listened with empathy, with presence. Gabriel found himself telling his story without regret, without hurt. For the first time, he felt he could love again, but this time calmly, without haste, with truth. Isabel went on her own. She learned from acquaintances that she had withdrawn from social media, changed her lifestyle, and started attending therapy. No one saw that impulsive sparkle in her eyes anymore. It was as if something had been erased. She no longer tried to look for him. She accepted the end. And perhaps this was her greatest lesson, that love, when untended, doesn't scream, it leaves silently and never returns. One day, much further on, she crossed paths with Gabriel at a craft fair. He was with Marina, laughing about something trivial. Isabel saw him from afar, hesitated to approach, but then he saw her too. Their eyes met, and he waved gently. There was no anger, only distance. She smiled back, with a mixture of gratitude and grief. They didn't speak. There was no need. And it was there, among flower huts and the scent of coffee, that she understood that the love she had once had, that simple, calm, sincere love, was gone forever. And more than that, it had found a new home, one that would never be forgotten, because it had been truly remade. In the days that followed, something in Gabriel began to adjust slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if his body and soul had finally understood that love, however painful it may be to leave, cannot forever carry what no longer exists. He no longer felt anger, no longer had that bitter heat that burned his chest at the memory of what had been done to him. Now what lived inside was quieter, heavier perhaps, but also clearer. It was the awareness that, even with all the pain, he had done everything in his power. No decision of his had led him to the destruction of what he believed to be eternal. The error lay not in the intensity with which he loved, nor in the patience with which he waited, nor in the naivete of trusting. It lay in the hands of those who, having everything to remain, chose to leave, not with their bodies, but with respect, with their memories, with the truth. It was still impossible to sleep soundly every night, but now the days were less cloudy. He woke with more energy, with more clarity. He had rediscovered in the silence of the morning a kind of peace he hadn't known for a long time. It wasn't complete happiness, nor a sudden enthusiasm for life, but a gentle rebirth, a prolonged breath after having been submerged for so long. Marina, with her serene manner and confident gaze, appeared like a constant breeze, without invading any space, simply filling the voids he no longer knew existed. She asked for nothing, didn't demand explanations, didn't seek to fulfill any role other than to be there, present, whole. And perhaps that was what touched Gabriel most, the freedom to be who he was, without needing to justify everything he had experienced before. It wasn't easy to love again. There were scars that hurt in places he thought he'd already healed. Sometimes he hesitated before touching, before promising, before giving himself completely. But little by little, he learned that loving after a wound isn't about starting over from scratch, it's about continuing with awareness. Marina never forced him to forget, she simply reminded him that the past doesn't define the present, much less should it steal the future. Gabriel learned to admire this in her, the way she welcomed his silences, how she respected his bad days, how she saw value in the way he cared for even the little things. At many moments, he wondered if he still knew how to love. But all it took was one gesture from her, the right word spoken at the right time, to realize that affection still existed within him, not the old, exhausted, sickly kind, but a new one, lighter, more conscious, more dignified. Isabel, on the other hand, spent her days rebuilding. Not of her image, but of her identity. She had stopped clinging to what she had been, to what she had lost, and now she was trying to understand who she was alone, without external references, without support. She no longer sought contact with Gabriel, not out of pride, but because she had learned, the hard way, that some losses cannot be returned. Longing was coming, like a tide insisting on invading dry land. She missed what he represented, the peace he offered, the stability she had never valued while she had it. She began to frequent simple places, to avoid noisy environments, to reconnect with things she had neglected out of foolish pride. She began to write, not to apologize, but to understand herself. In her texts, she relived pain, admitted guilt, and registered regrets. She realized she had never loved Gabriel as he had loved her, and that perhaps that was her greatest mistake, not having the courage to say so before destroying him. Carla also went through a period of separation. She wanted to give herself space, respect everyone's time, including her own. After Gabriel's confession and the silent embrace, she had to face her own shadow. She felt guilty for not having revealed the truth sooner, for having hesitated to protect someone who deserved it, for having allowed herself to be deceived by her sister. But she also felt relief for finally having done the right thing. Her relationship with Isabel was fractured for a time. There was too much pain, too much hurt, and even with blood ties, not everything heals with forgiveness. They spoke again months later, cautiously, without any displays of affection, only with the knowledge that they were sisters, but that they now belonged to different worlds and different truths. Little by little, everyone involved in that whirlwind found different ways to move forward. Gabriel returned to old habits, reconnected with friends who had drifted apart, and began writing again in his black-covered notebook, the one Isabel never knew existed. There, he recorded thoughts, fears, and small joys. It wasn't a diary, it was a safe space where he could exist unfiltered. One of those nights, sitting on the porch next to Marina, he read one of the texts to her. It spoke of choices, of paths that cross and then diverge, of the power of starting over without carrying grudges. She listened silently, holding his hand firmly. And in that touch, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. But the dilemma still lingered. Not the dilemma of whether or not to return to Isabel, because that door was already closed, but the moral dilemma of knowing to what extent we are responsible for the pain we cause and the pain we accept to carry. Gabriel reflected on this often. Why didn't he see it sooner? Why did he insist when there was no longer any reciprocity? Why did he forgive so quickly? And why, even after everything, did he still feel a kind of silent compassion for the one who hurt him? Marina said this was strength, but he thought it was just a remnant of his essence, someone who, even after so much, still believed that people aren't born evil, they just get lost. The memory of his unborn child was still an open wound. Sometimes he dreamed of him, other times he mentally replayed scenes that never happened, a first step, a drawing on the wall, a laugh echoing through the room. Absence became presence in details. But over time, he learned to deal with it differently. He no longer tried to erase the pain, but transformed it into something that would drive him forward. Marina helped him with this. One day, finding a drawing by an unknown child on a park bench, he kept it. He said it was a sign that some pains are not to be forgotten, but embraced. And that's what he began to do, embrace his pains as parts of himself, not as monsters to be avoided. Isabel, for her part, read and reread all the letters she had rescued. Sometimes aloud, as if trying to summon back a time that no longer exists. On a cloudy afternoon, sitting alone on a park bench, she wrote her last letter to Gabriel. Not to send. Just to lighten the burden. In it, she didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did she try to justify anything. She simply thanked him. For everything he was, for everything she had learned from the pain, for everything his silence had taught her. She concluded by saying she hoped he was well, that he had found someone who looked at him with the same truth he had always looked at her. And for the first time in a long time, he cried, not out of guilt, but out of acceptance. The descending action of that story, though full of full stops, still held an ellipsis. Because no matter how much time passes, certain marks remain. Not as wounds, but as reminders of who we were, who we chose to be. Gabriel knew he would never go back to who he was before, but he also knew this was a form of growth. Marina, by his side, wasn't trying to erase the past, but to help him write a new chapter. And he, with his hands now steadier, began to understand that true love, the kind that remains even when everything else disappears, is the one we have for ourselves. The story wasn't over yet, but now it was being told with a different voice, a different rhythm, a different soul. Because after everything he'd been through, Gabriel was about to discover that some scars, when finally accepted, can become the most beautiful part of who we are. And it was precisely this discovery that, unbeknownst to him, awaited him at the end of the road. There was a light breeze that morning when Gabriel left home early, with no specific destination in mind. He walked streets he didn't usually walk, as if his body were asking for new paths even without knowing where it wanted to go. His step was firm, but his gaze was lost. The last few weeks had been a kind of emotional reconfiguration, where everything that once seemed definitive now rearranged itself into new ways of feeling and existing. Marina, always attentive, respected his silences without trying to fill them. She was a constant presence, but never invasive. He knew that what they were experiencing now was more than a late-life romance, it was the first time he had loved with full awareness of love's fragility. And for that very reason, there was no urgency, only a gradual surrender, like someone who plants a plant slowly and watches each leaf grow. But even with all this lightness, Gabriel secretly harbored a doubt, a question he had never had the courage to ask, not even to himself: could there still be love for Isabel somewhere? He never looked for her again. And although he no longer missed her, there were days when the memory returned not with pain, but with a silent curiosity about how she was, who she had become after the ruin. Because there's something strange about the way the past inhabits us, even when overcome, it clings to us in details that time cannot erase. A smell, a snippet of music, a bend in the street. Gabriel accepted this, not as a burden, but as part of his story. And it was with this kind of thought that, as he turned a corner, he found something he hadn't expected, a small, new studio, its window delicately decorated, inviting, and Isabel's name signed on the wooden plaque. His feet stopped, his heart beat faster, but there was no fear. Only surprise. He stood there, watching from across the sidewalk. Inside, she was organizing some items, focused, unaware of his presence. She was different. Lighter, perhaps. Simpler. There was an air about her of someone who had finally stopped running. Gabriel hesitated to cross. He wasn't sure if he should. But before he could decide, she saw him. Isabel's gaze froze for a moment, then softened, and she walked to the door. She opened it slowly, with a smile that mixed nervousness and peace. He approached, and she, without saying anything, simply nodded, inviting him in. The space was small and welcoming, with light wood furniture, plants in ceramic pots, and paintings with phrases that, somehow, spoke more about healing than decoration. It was clear that this place wasn't just a business, it was a new beginning. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice still low. "Neither did I," he replied, looking around. "But I guess, somehow, it made sense." She smiled slightly, without irony, and offered him coffee. He declined, but stayed. There was something in her gaze he hadn't seen in years, perhaps a naked sincerity, unfiltered, unburdened by expectations. They sat in 2 armchairs near the window. The sun streamed in shyly, illuminating only part of her face. It was then that Isabel began to speak. She didn't apologize, didn't try to undo anything. She simply told him. She said she'd spent months in silence, isolated, relearning to live without emotional crutches. That she'd distanced herself from her sister, her friends, her social media, and that this studio was her first real gesture of returning to the world. She said that only now did she truly understand what Gabriel meant, but that she also understood that this understanding came too late. "I had to lose everything to discover the value of what I threw away," he confessed, his eyes moist, but without crying. "Sometimes, pain is the only teacher we listen to," he replied firmly, without resentment. "And you?" she asked. "Are you okay?" Gabriel smiled, for the first time that morning, and briefly told him about Marina. Not in detail, not out of disrespect, but because he understood that this now belonged to another story. She said she was a different woman, with a way that soothed, never suffocating. Isabel listened in silence, and for a moment, she averted her eyes to the ground. There was a quiet pride in her face, not that he had followed, but that he had managed to follow so cleanly, so dignifiedly. They stood there for a few more minutes, unhurried, like 2 acquaintances reunited after having been everything to each other, and now looking at each other with gratitude for what they were, not with longing for what they could have been. "I could never get back what I erased," she said, looking at a small frame with a handwritten phrase on it. "But I've learned that some losses can't be recovered. They can only be accepted. And that's where the healing begins," Gabriel added. They parted with a restrained hug, without promises of reunion, but with renewed respect. As he left, Gabriel took a deep breath. He no longer felt pain. He no longer missed her. He felt something rarer, peace with the past. And perhaps that was what he had desired most throughout that journey. When he arrived home, Marina was waiting for him, sitting on the porch, reading a random book. He approached, sat beside her, and gently took her hand. She could tell in his eyes that something had happened, but didn't ask. Gabriel kissed her hand and whispered that she was the best part of the future he hadn't known he would have. Marina simply smiled, as if she understood everything even without hearing a word. In the following days, Gabriel began writing more frequently again. Not just scattered thoughts, but chapters. He began recording his story not as a rant, but as a testimony. He wanted what he experienced to somehow serve others. Not to avoid pain, because some pain needs to be felt, but to remind himself that life goes on, that rebuilding is possible, and that no one is defined solely by the loves they've lost. And it was one late afternoon, while writing at the porch table, that Marina approached with an envelope in her hands. He said he'd found it at a used book fair, lost among old pages. Gabriel opened it curiously and found a card, blank except for a sentence written in cursive: "Everything that life takes away is sometimes what saves us." He tucked the card into his notebook, between the pages of the part he hadn't yet written. And there, he understood that some stories don't need happy endings, just true ones. Because it is in truth, and only in truth, that lies the chance for a worthwhile new beginning. And now, finally, he was ready for that new beginning. In the following months, the seasons changed almost imperceptibly for Gabriel. Nature followed its rhythm, indifferent to the emotional patches he silently sowed. The pain had settled into a small corner, like something that no longer demanded attention, but remained there, a silent reminder of what had been. He reconnected with life unhurriedly, savoring the days with more presence, with greater respect for the timing of things. His relationship with Marina matured with the same delicacy with which flowers grow after winter. It wasn't made of promises, but of surrender. Gabriel learned to love with his feet on the ground, eyes open, and scars visible, and perhaps that's why it was the most sincere love he'd ever experienced. At no point did Marina attempt to occupy spaces that weren't hers, and he, in turn, never expected her to be someone she wasn't. Between them, there was balance, but above all, there was truth. One night, as they ate dinner under the soft light of the balcony, Marina asked if he had completely forgiven. Gabriel thought for a moment, chewing the question more than his food. He said yes, but with an addendum, that the forgiveness he offered wasn't a rescue from the other person, but a gift to himself. That forgiveness was the only way to free himself from the emotional prison that hurt creates. Marina smiled, with that look of someone who understands without needing to say it. And there, between half-full glasses and forks resting on plates, Gabriel knew he had reached the end of his journey. The past still existed, but it no longer ruled. Isabel, on the other hand, faced the thorns of a path she herself had planted. The studio, though simple, was her refuge and also her penance. There, among fabrics and paints, she reconnected with the pieces of herself she had neglected for years. She served her few clients with an almost sacred care, as if each order were a new chance to do something right. The nights were still long, and loneliness sometimes weighed heavily, especially on Sundays. She didn't seek new relationships. She didn't want to disguise the hole she'd dug. She preferred to live with him. A twisted but honest form of penance. The only contact she maintained with Carla was through letters, exchanged a few times over the months. Timid attempts to restore, if not the bond, at least the respect between sisters. Carla, over time, responded less coldly, but without opening doors. For her, trust was like fine china, once cracked, never the same again. One day, Isabel received a special order. A couple was ordering a custom piece to commemorate their union. When she read the names on the order, her heart skipped a beat, Gabriel and Marina. She stared at the paper for minutes, as if staring into an unexpected mirror. She didn't cry. She just smiled at the corner of her mouth, with that kind of resigned sadness that doesn't scream. She called the phone number left to confirm the details. Marina answered. The sweet voice on the other end of the line disarmed her. They spoke cordially, without revealing anything. Isabel confirmed the order, wrote everything down accurately. And days later, she personally delivered it to the address provided, by hand. Marina greeted her kindly, as always, and for a second, the two looked at each other in silence. Neither of them needed to say anything. Everything was clear. Isabel handed over the box, thanked her, and turned to leave. But before descending the first step, she heard a firm voice behind her. It was Gabriel. He had been watching from afar. He walked to the door, said simply, "Thank you," and offered a handshake. She accepted. It was brief, but firm. And with that, they sealed the end of everything. There was no more resentment, but there was also no room for nostalgia. Only the definitive clarity that each had moved on. Carla, in turn, found new meaning for herself. She decided to move to another city and start a volunteer project with vulnerable children. She wanted to do something real, something that would reconnect her purpose with the world. The experience reconnected her with parts of herself that had been dormant. She felt useful, in motion, part of something bigger. She carried Gabriel in her heart with respect, but without any pending issues. She knew that, in some way, she had contributed to his restoration, not as a savior, but as a living reminder that love, when true, also knows how to respect boundaries. She maintained contact with Marina, casually, affectionately. The two understood each other effortlessly, perhaps because neither needed to prove anything to the other. Months passed. Gabriel and Marina married in an intimate ceremony by a lake. Few guests, no ostentation. Just people who understood firsthand what it means to begin again with dignity. When exchanging vows, Gabriel said he was there not to forget what he'd experienced, but to honor what he'd learned. He said Marina was the mirror in which he saw himself whole for the first time after his fall. She, in turn, thanked him for choosing to continue loving, even after being hurt. She said his courage inspired her, and that together, they would be memory and construction. At the end of the ceremony, amid applause and smiles, there was silence. That kind of good, complete silence, where nothing needs to be said because everything has already been felt. Isabel learned of the wedding through a shared post. She looked at the photo of the two smiling and felt a pang that was no longer of envy, but of conscience. For the first time, she understood what it meant to lose someone deservedly. There was no revenge, no scandal, no drama. Gabriel simply left. He moved on. Silently. As great loves do when they discover they've been hurt beyond return. And this absence was what hurt the most, not abandonment, but the final silence of someone who gave everything, and left with nothing. Gabriel's story is shared by many. People who were betrayed, forgotten, neglected, but chose not to sink. He was brutally wounded, lost faith, lost memories, lost himself in many moments. But in the end, he chose to restore his essence. He chose to love again, even after so much. And that makes him great. The lesson is clear and profound: betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person, it destroys the betrayer, the liar, the manipulator. It breaks up families, erases memories, builds walls where bridges once stood. And even if forgiveness comes, as it did, nothing ever goes back to the way it was. Love is fragile. And trust, once broken, is never whole again. Comment below with your thoughts on this story. We want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Gabriel was right to forgive? Do you think Isabel deserved a second chance? And what would you do in his place? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this, and share this message with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. The stories here are fictional, but the feelings are real, because the pain of being betrayed is not fiction. Betrayal is not a mistake. It's a choice. And every choice has consequences. Choose to love truly, and be loved in return. Because true love doesn't hurt, doesn't hide, doesn't destroy. True love builds. And those who destroy almost always discover it, too late.